But anyway, so let's go ahead and talk about pollution control, and then after that we'll just talk about the final project, the exams. I've got an idea about the exams, and then we'll go from there. I can't see this lasting too long. Okay, you guys must have got my emails. Okay, well, really what I wanted to talk about in pollution control. I based this on a chapter in a book by Novotny, Vladimir Novotny, and he talks about pollution control. And I'm just going to talk about two types, or two sort of areas, urban and rural pollution control. But Novotny, is kind of interestingly enough, divides urban diffuse pollution control into sort of 4 categories or 4 areas. And one being prevention, and source control. The other one being hydrologic modification. The other one, source reduction. And I don't know the difference between source reduction and prevention really, but and then end of pipe controls, and of course this is all about NPDES over here. So he talks about that, and let's have a look at what that, how Novotny talks about prevention. When he talks about prevention, it's often about regulation. So it's like, from now, and it's a big thing. So one of the things would have been going from leaded to unleaded gas. Banning things like DDT and PCBs and things like that. So these are fairly large ones. Public education. Have you seen those little fish that they put down next to the drain sometimes? They say, well, this drain goes into the river.
Yeah.
So I don't know what studies there are about public education, but probably someone's going to say, oh, that's interesting. Let me pour my oil down here anyway. Okay. And then they do things like surface protection. They'll mulch an area, or put some soil or put some vegetation down so a runoff doesn't happen. And then they do a lot of street sweeping. I know there's a fair amount of studies. A lot of your dust, airborne dust and things like that, on the streets comes from car tires. So you've got nasty things in the tires like selenium, heavy metals, and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the general control of urban pollution, and that's often sort of embedded into the system of the city that you have. In terms of hydrologic modification, you guys really saw the storm hydrograph of what's that place? The Smith Branch down? No, it's not Smith Branch. Rocky Creek over here. So Rocky Creek does this every time you get a rainstorm. Little or no base flow, and you essentially get sort of this flood, and that's it. So that's not really a desirable thing. And so what you find now in a lot of the new shopping malls, they will do something else. And essentially what they're trying to do is build things that, if you have something like this, instead of having all of this volume chunder out there immediately, you'll have it come out and it would slowly release. And so you create hydrographs where the area under the hydrograph is equal to this one, but the release is much slower. And often the biggest hydrologic modification they do is, for instance, build these storm retention ponds. So the retention pond would kind of look like this, with the pipe on the other side. All the storm water comes in here. I've got some nice pens today. All the nasty storm water comes in over here, and then it starts filling up. Your sediment settles out there, and then it gets to a point where you've got an overflow pipe. And it's usually designed for a fairly large storm. So it allows, this overflow then allows the water to come up and then it starts draining. So there's already some settlement or treatment in there. And if you remember the runoff equation, SCS runoff curve number, Q equals P minus initial abstraction squared, P minus IA squared, IA plus S. So the initial, hey, how's it going? Sorry about that. No, that's okay. You missed a great show. So, I mean, it's your loss. The initial abstraction thing is really what we're trying to look at. Initial abstraction is going to be the pore space in the water that, in the soils that the water first goes into, and you want to try and maximize that as much as possible. And then I think this term, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the surface storage component as well. So you're really, with this hydrologic modification, you're artificially, in this case, kind of artificially increasing these factors. So that P minus this factor, and then this factor over here is at the bottom, the denominator. So the higher this goes, the lower that runoff number is going to be. So it's all aimed at reducing runoff. So you go to some of these large shopping malls today, modern shopping malls, modern shopping complexes, say out at Sand Hills. And in fact, if you go down here to next to the convention center, below and between the convention center and where do the guys play the basketball? What's it called? The Coliseum. Between the Coliseum and the convention center, you'll see a huge retention pond there. And what we'll do, I think, in our field trip is go there next week. I'll just show you. It's pretty darn big, and that's practical. And so water comes in, settles out the gunk here, and then after a while you have some reeds. You know, they probably encourage some reeds to grow, or you know, some kind of wetland plants that then also serve as a little bit of a filter. So that's kind of one of the things that they would do, that do that hydromodification. One of the reasons why we don't have this down here at Rocky Creek is because all of that is old buildings. You know, today, any kind of development will have to have a stormwater type plan that retains stormwater. And this is, if you guys go back, remember we talked about MS4, municipal storm sewer separation. Basically, they're saying every city, okay, or certain large cities, you're no longer allowed to just say that's non-point source pollution. That's we're telling you that's point source pollution. From now on, you've got to treat it before it goes out. And you might treat it like this or in a wetland, but you're not going to let it down into the stream. So, and I think really that's fairly effective in terms of trying to treat non-point source pollution, because if you tell Joe and Fred to stop walking their dogs or to pick up their dog poop, Fred might pick up the dog poop, but Joe might not. So that's kind of what it is. Couple of other things, or a few other things in terms of urban diffuse pollution. You have these civil engineering sort of marvels that they put together, where you've got pervious pavement and things like that. But the fact is that even if you've got pervious pavement, over time, it's better than having impervious area. But your soil is still covered, and over time, I think they become less and less effective. Have you heard of this? Well, I think it's going to come up anyways. Well, let me just talk about it very quickly. Have you heard of this notion of first flush? Have I talked to you about that? If you have a storm hydrograph and you have this kind of response, have you heard of first flush before? Everybody's looking very sage. Okay. Your first flush basically, well, let's think about this logically. Where, if this is your rainfall event that's caused your problem, and obviously this is your rising limb over here, where is the majority of your non-point source pollution? Where are your highest concentrations of non-point source pollution going to be in the storm hydrograph?
Like early in the curve?
Real
it's all the stuff that's sitting on the surface.
Exactly. So that's why they call it the first flush. So, you know, for instance, the storm sewers, you know, the cat's gone in there. You've seen the cats living in the storm sewers before? You know, they take a dump or take some dead rats down there, and, you know, there's all sorts of garbage. Well, that first flush is going to happen. Often, they say, usually in the first 5% of the volumetric flow of that particular storm hydrograph. So that's kind of where you want to kind of catch the most of it. And so this retention pond we were talking about will actually do a pretty decent job of catching that first flush. It goes in here, sits down. The overflow of the supernatant liquid is a lot cleaner, at least from sediments and stuff like that. So that's the basic principle of that. Where did I put my notes? Okay. You know, some of these things, have you ever seen the second part, you know, where you're reducing pollution from the source? So you're saying, okay, you've got this pollutant, and then, you know, you put a barrier in between and you've got a lot less pollutant. I think this picture of these silt fences, it's so freaking laughable to see how ineffective they are. You know, they'll put them up because regulations tell you to. But you don't, you know, first of all, you've got to put it up properly, but often, even properly, the amount of silt coming down or the amount of runoff that's created by compaction up in a building site like this is unbelievable. So I've been to building sites where that happens, and it's laughable and also kind of sad. So, you know, these are regulations. Often regulations for building will have that done. They also put things called buffer strips. So you've heard of buffer strips, and often there's a county ordinance or a city ordinance that requires, you know, you've got a stream, and then you've got to put a buffer strip in. You know, and they have these city council meetings where, you know, everybody's arguing. Oh, it should be 150 foot. No, it's got to be 50 foot and stuff like that. So, what do you think Ray Archuleta would call these strips over here? What kind of do you remember Ray Archuleta, the guy who talked about soil health? Do you remember his talk? Do you remember what he called these practices? Things like buffer strips. He called them diaper practices. He called them diaper practices. Why did he call them diaper practices? Is because if you've got, let's talk about the city. If you've got impervious area over here, you know, and say you've got 100 or 200 or, you know, several blocks of impervious area, houses, lawns where the soil's being compacted and, you know, nothing's happening, your streets, sidewalks and that kind of stuff. When the water starts flowing, these diaper practices have very, very little effect. I'm not saying don't have diaper practices, because one of the things with riparian buffers is that you can grow trees over here. And when you grow trees, you can lower the temperature of your water, keep the DO up in the summer. Okay, so I'm not saying that we shouldn't have buffer strips. But what I am saying is we're ignoring the fact that we're building vast areas that are absolutely chock-a-block full of impervious area or damaged soil. Okay, so, and the same really can be said about rural practices or practices in farming. If you're doing a conventional till, where you're tilling up the soil all the time, you're really breaking down soil structure, reducing the amount of macropores that are there, and so the farmer might think that he's tilling the soil and fluffing it up, but after a couple of rainfall events, that soil has really collapsed in on itself. All the organic matter is gone, and so the soil continues to erode. It doesn't allow water to infiltrate, it runs off, and riparian buffers, again, don't do much. And what happens, one of the things that kind of makes them less effective in sort of farming situations is often, let's suppose this is a farm field that's conventionally tilled, is you will find that these rills then begin to form with the topography, and you will have concentrated flow that goes down in here. So it's not like the flow off this farm field is like this sheet, like Hortonian, it's called Hortonian flow, that kind of evenly flows and gently flows into the buffer strip. It kind of does this. And so you get all this gunky material coming into that buffer. Anyway. This is going to be a short talk. One of the things, there's a guy called Hugh Hammond Bennett. You can have a look at all these other diaper practices like catch basins and stormwater detention ponds and wetlands. Again, it's not that they're bad, it's just that they're kind of solutions that you've now had to put in after the problem's created. So I don't know how you could reduce that in the cities except to start educating people about creating rain gardens. Rain gardens would be a good thing, or you do some crazy stuff like I do in the yard next to me. Basically, I have a big old garden and grow cover crops. Cover crops are that high and roots are deep, and we've got infiltration there, and right next door we've got puddles forming. So, but urban stormwater is obviously a big thing. In the rural areas, what has happened in the past, often the prevailing wisdom has been, in farming areas, the prevailing wisdom often was you need to till the soil so that you can fluff it up so that the water infiltrates into the soil. And in fact, nothing can be further from the truth. There's a study out in Ohio that's about to come out where they were able to refute this and suggest or recommend no-till practices. So no-till would be guys not going over the fields with tillers or plows or anything like that, but they would plant into a bed of mulch and then really continuing from there would grow cover crops over that soil, keep the soil covered year-round, either with a canopy or a living or a mulch of some sorts, which is created by the previous crop. And in that way, they would increase infiltration and reduce runoff. Ray Archuleta said, we don't have a runoff problem in this country, we have an infiltration problem. I think you guys might have remembered that. And the idea is that an infiltration problem is that we don't pay enough. If we think of our problems as just a runoff problem, we're thinking of how do I catch that runoff and store it and divert it and release it into the water. By that stage, it's too late. So the idea of approaching it as an infiltration problem is, how do I treat the cause of that problem? Basically, low infiltration rates. Low infiltration rates, at the bottom line, is they're going to come down to low amounts of pore space. How can I manage the pore space in an urban or rural environment? And so that's kind of at the heart of any kind of question of really addressing infiltration. And I think that's kind of, all of these practices you see are kind of old school. They will continue with, big developers and that kind of stuff. But I think, your generation is going to see people who start addressing infiltration a little bit more effectively. You're going over to Africa, you'll see infiltration problems because people put villages down and, walk from place to place, and you'll have paths and cattle will trample and that kind of stuff. And so every time there's a rainstorm, you have erosion. So what do? You start talking about it. One of the easiest thing or best things you can do is start covering those bare spots. And what I've seen in Uganda, for instance, is you start covering these bare spots, and the climate is so amazing. Within a very short time, you'll find that underneath where you've put that organic matter, pore space has been created by all the critters that are eating this organic matter. So that's kind of I diverge a little bit, but that's kind of what I see happening in your generation. Is you're going to start looking at how do we increase infiltration rather than how do we use engineers to manage all of this runoff we've created.
When I was in the middle of the country, there was just like thousands of acres of like just used to be farmland, but it's now just gullies because all it was any time it rained, we just cut down these rivers and stream beds. It was awful.
And if you go back about 100 years or so, there are places in Georgia where they actually had man-made canyons that were once cotton fields. Now we're talking canyons with walls 100 foot plus high because of erosion. And people just, the way you grow food or cotton is you plow, you plant, you add fertilizer. And, we know a little bit better now, but there are a lot of farmers, a lot of academics who still believe, or agronomists, production people who believe that, you've got to do it, you've got to till, you've got to clean the soil, have the soil bare before you put your crop in. And that makes a big difference. All right, questions about this? That's about the shortest class we've had. But, if you, I think the Ray Archuleta talk that I got you guys to do, you guys did watch it, didn't you? Yeah. That really deals with it now. Obviously, it doesn't have a very strong urban component. But at the end of the day, it's about pore space management. So, anyway, did you guys have questions about pollution control? And if not, we'll go back and talk about TMDLs in a few minutes. Or in fact, let's make it discursive and talk about this as well. Stu?
I was just going to say, in an urban setting, how bad are lawns relative to other impervious surfaces? Because this is one of kind of my pet peeves. I hate lawns.
Lawns, what happens is that people cut their lawns and then keep them very, very short. And so the rule of thumb is the height that your grass on average grows is the depth to which your soil roots grow. So for instance, my lawn I probably cut about 4 times in the summer. So I allow it to grow like that.
Shaggy.
Yeah. So it's a little bit shaggy, yeah. But so if you allow the lawn to grow, that's good. But the other problem with lawns is often they're monocultures.
Yeah.
And so from an ecological services point of view, they don't add that much value. They do a little bit better if they're taller. The other thing is leaf cover. Is my soils class. It's kind of interesting. Some of the people who were married and stuff like that in my soils class stopped raking their leaves, and that's what I did about 5 years ago. I would rake my leaves into my flower beds or collect them, and I would actually blow leaves off the street and into my yard. Yeah, because leaves. Remember that leaves are made up of carbon. And carbon is basically the food or the energy currency in the soil. When you put that down, soil organisms start utilizing that carbon and basically start creating underground ecosystems. And underground ecosystems, once you form those, you're starting to restore your soil health. I've got a bed that I have some roses in, that 5 years ago was basically just hard clay, and I basically gave up. And then I heard about this stuff, and for a season just left a pile of leaves like that, and I went back after it, and it's like, in the spring, and it's like, whoa, what happened? That soil suddenly changed. It was soft, it was darker, and now, now you go there, and it's like, wow, did you import this soil? That kind of thing. So these, I think environmental experts who want to sell you services are often going to want to charge you a whole bunch of money to do this. And often you do very simple things: cover the soil, keep a plant in the ground, let your plants grow, a little bit of diversity, have a chaos garden like mine. And subscribe to a different sort of urban aesthetic. So I don't know if that really answers your question. But.
Well, it's just more kind of, I was curious as to whether there is a more integrative approach to, what we call diaper practices for a large urban area. Like if you had the opportunity to city plan from the ground up, would there really be, in how we build things today, would there really be a viable solution to things like that? Or is it just, we need this much space for buildings, and outside of that, we're kind of screwed?
Yeah. Well, in America, we don't do a very good job because we believe that, for a family of 5, you need 2,500 square foot. It is what it is. But there are organizations, EPA, I can't remember what the program was, but EPA had a program, I think, in DC, where they started doing things like buying rain barrels, doing rain gardens and things like that. That's not too bad. Tree people in Los Angeles, I think I listened to the guy in 1998 and I thought that was pretty good. Planting trees, huge positive. Remember, trees intercept a lot of your rainfall initially, okay? Provide a lot of cover for the ground, cool the ground off, reduce the amount of evaporation. So that's one of the things. As soon as you introduce vertical plant diversity in your landscape, that's going to help. Rain barrels are a solution, but they're darned expensive. So it's all going to lie in your vegetation and how much vegetation you can put in there. And usually that vertical diversity is kind of what does it for you.
Is it more of a footprint effect from the building? So if you built up rather than out, it would probably be easier to manage your precipitation because at that point you're only concerned about the vertical.
Well, yeah, that's the footprint thing. So I mean, from an environmental standpoint, the higher you can build or the more square footage in the house you can put up, the better for the land. Yeah.
Towards the end of the time I was doing environmental consulting in Atlanta, and that was around 2008 or so. We were seeing a lot more of those live, work, play, design communities.
Everything's self-contained.
Yeah, everything in one area. And vertical on top of each other, and a lot of them, or there were a few of them that had things like green roofs and constructed wetlands for their stormwater and that kind of thing. So it looked like they were starting to
Started
consider
moving
it
in that direction.
right before everything collapsed. So.
Yeah.
How many of them actually got
Before
built.
the money dried up.
But
Yeah.
it was definitely a change from the beginning when it was just rape and
Space,
scrape
space,
everything.
space.
And,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right. Well, you know, and unfortunately, often the design of these things, for a house that might normally cost $100,000, you might pay $150,000. So what's happening is your more affluent people can live in that neighborhood, but you go down to Pinehurst, and you know, any time the soil's exposed, you know, it's exposed down to the subsoil, and you've got a lot of erosion. You've got a lot of these empty parking lots, and you know, it's really bad. So, you know, your generation is going to have to come up with ideas that sort of mimic nature, and that you can do, that's not sort of boutique oriented, that's for people, for everybody, and especially for people who don't have that kind of money to invest in.
Yeah, and I mean, I lived in Dallas for 4 years, and it's just any time it rained, everything flooded. And granted, it didn't rain that often, but like it's literally hundreds of square miles, hundreds and hundreds of square miles.
Yeah.
And there's no plants anywhere.
Yeah.
And it's just scary.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Did you guys have any comments about the Tmdl exercise? What did you guys think? I'll pretend I didn't have the conversation with you.
I mean, it was the fact that there are that many of them that are still being written. It's like,
I didn't realize there's that.
And each one of them is what, like a 30 to 90 page document. It's like,
Well, I think I asked you in the question, how easy do you think that Tmdl plan is going to be to implement practically?
For all of them?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we'll be alive to see it.
yeah. won't happen in our lifetime.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all.
Keep adding to the list too.
Yeah.
So when you sort of heard my cynicism, I guess when I was talking about it last week, I sounded a little bit cynical. Do you understand my cynicism?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
If I didn't then, I picked it up. Yeah, I was reading that.
Yeah. So you know, in these particular regulations, I think. You know, if you do a cost-benefit analysis, there's no benefit to this. I think there's a very good benefit, you know, if you're doing the MS4 systems and, you know, you're telling the guys with the big confined animal feeding operations to sort of, you know, that you've got a permit then. But telling individuals to fix their stuff, it's very, very difficult. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's what got me was the implementation, and most of it just seemed like, okay, we're going to educate the people, and we're going to, you know,
and
encourage them, and, you know.
Urge and educate, and there's this pharmacist program and stuff like that. Yeah.
You know.
I think the Bush River implementation, the one that Andy did, they got about $300,000 for something like 200 square kilometers. It's like, what do you do? Where do you start? And I did my PhD there, and we all knew, after I had done some work, we knew where one big source of pollution came, but and I sort of let people know about it, and nobody wanted to act on it because it was a curmudgeonly old dairyman, and he would have basically run them off his land. But I said, there's your source of pollution. And I think I calculated that particular dairy was creating as much pollution as a trailer park of, I think, 200 trailers where all of the septic systems had gone bad. You know, that kind of number. So. Will you guys be able to do a load duration curve?
Yeah.
I can figure it out. Probably.
less than 3 weeks.
Most likely.
Well, let me turn this off and then